When my son-in-law rudely demanded the keys to my seaside villa as a gift on my daughter's birthday, I thought he was joking. But when I refused, he struck me right there in front of the guests, and the room went dead silent. I simply walked out and made one phone call. 15 minutes later, a man walked in, and the moment they realized who he was, every face in that room drained of color. Welcome to Dad's Revenge. I'm glad you found your way here. If these stories of family patience and hard-won justice resonate with you, a like and a subscription mean more than you know. Before we begin, I'd love to hear from you. In the comments, is this your first story with us? Or have you been here a while? Either way, you're welcome. One quick note. Some details in this story have been shaped for the purposes of storytelling, and any resemblance to specific real people or events is purely coincidental. What matters is the truth at the heart of it. The string trio in the corner went silent mid-note. The waiters might as well have been sculptures, trays of champagne, suspended in the air, nobody breathing. The keys, Gerald. Brant's voice was the only sound in the room. My son-in-law, a title I was already regretting, stood above me, his expression caught somewhere between fury and raw entitlement. The Palm Beach estate property. That's what Natalie actually deserves for her 35th birthday, not some bracelet. I ran my tongue along the inside of my cheek. Blood. The $12,000 sapphire bracelet I'd handed Natalie just 15 minutes earlier suddenly seemed beside the point. A fist to the jaw has a way of rearranging your priorities like that. Brant, please. Natalie's voice broke on the words. She hadn't moved from her spot near the gift table, her new bracelet catching the light. Tears were running freely down her face, but her feet weren't carrying her toward me. They weren't carrying her toward him either. She was anchored to the floor, as though she'd been rehearsing this particular stillness for years. Your father has no idea how things work in a real family. Brant straightened his jacket. Brioni almost certainly financed with a loan from me 6 months back. The villa isn't even being used. We need it. We've earned it. Earned it. There it was again, that word. Brant had been reaching for it constantly lately. He'd earned investment opportunities. He'd earned a stake in my restaurant operation. Earned. The man seemed to believe that a marriage certificate to my daughter was a blank check drawn on my account. I got to my feet, slowly taking my time. 64 years have taught me that quiet is often the sharpest weapon you have. Give them silence and they'll drown themselves in it. Dad, I'm so sorry, Natalie began. Don't apologize on his behalf, sweetheart. My tone stayed even, despite the pulse of pain running through my jaw. I scanned the room. The guests had already sorted themselves. Half wore expressions of open horror. The other half, Brant's people, mostly looked faintly satisfied, as if they'd just watched an overdue correction. Brant's mother, Corinne Dillon, had a thin smile pulling at the corner of her mouth. That smile handed me all the information I required. We're family, Brant said, closing the distance between us. Family shares everything. Or maybe you're just another one of those bitter old men who sits on his pile and watches his own children go without... The nerve of it was almost worth admiring. Brant, who rolled up in a Porsche Panamera and had a $40,000 Rolex Daytona on his wrist, a detail I'd registered just that morning, was now casting himself as the one scraping by. The businessman in me had to acknowledge the technique. The father in me felt something cold take root. This evening, I said, keeping my voice low has come to an end. I didn't give anyone a chance to answer. I moved past Brant, past the stunned crowd, past Natalie, who had her face buried in both hands. Past the table with the birthday cake sitting untouched lemon coconut, Natalie's favorite going back to when she was 7. I pushed through the door into the February air off Miami, stepping away from the restaurant I'd raised from the ground, with my own 2 hands, 20 years of my life poured into every brick. My phone was going off in my pocket, probably my manager wondering what had just happened. Nothing good. But there in the parking lot, with the harbor lights shimmering on the water below, something shifted inside me. Clarity. 3 years of making allowances. Brant was still finding his footing in the marriage. Brant had pressure on him with his development deals. Brant just needed one more shot, one more infusion, one more open door. I'd been so determined to stay out of Natalie's marriage that I'd turned myself into a mat for them to wipe their feet on. Worse, actually. I'd become a cash machine with a sign taped to it, reading, "Go ahead, take a swing. Enough." I was done absorbing punches, literal and otherwise. The jaw was throbbing. The pride stung worse. But beneath both of those, something harder was beginning to surface. Survival instinct. Cold calculation. Call it what you like. I've spent 40 years assembling a restaurant empire out of thin air. I know how to size a person up, find the crack in their foundation, and think 3 moves ahead before they've made their first. Brant believed he'd close the deal tonight. He assumed the public spectacle would hollow me out, leave me too embarrassed and beaten down to push back. Wrong. I took out my phone and arranged a car. Not a rideshare app. I had no patience for forced pleasantries. A private service, the kind where the driver reads the room and keeps his mouth shut. While I waited, I ran the footage in my head. Brant's swagger, Corinne's smile, Natalie's frozen expression, the room fracturing down the middle. Everything cataloged, everything stored. The car came. I got in the back and gave my address without looking up. Pulling away from Bay Terrace, I let myself take one last look back through the restaurant windows. The party had already resumed, of course. Brant would be working the room, now reframing the story, making himself the reasonable one. Let him enjoy it. I could wait. Every restaurant I'd ever opened was built on patience, on knowing when to move and when to hold. This would be no different. The driver's eyes found mine in the rear view. Rough night, sir. I pressed a finger to my jaw, already swelling, and smiled despite it. Hurt like hell. Just the beginning. The ride to my estate in Coral Gables ran 20 minutes. 20 minutes of Miami streetlights smearing past the glass. 20 minutes of memory pulling me back through 3 years of deliberate blindness. I thought about the very first time Brant pitched me on one of his developments. Same restaurant, Bay Terrace, different evening, my 61st birthday dinner. He'd been all energy and charm, going on about a mixed-use property out in Pompano Beach. Ground floor opportunity, he'd told me. No way to lose. Natalie had been radiant sitting next to him, lit up by her husband's ambition. $200,000. That was the number. Natalie slid her hand over mine at the table. It would mean so much to us, Dad. Not to him. To us. She'd already started speaking in his voice, carrying his desires as her own. I wrote the check. 6 months later, the project was rubble. Market conditions, Brant told me. Wrong timing. He said it the way you'd mention the spilling coffee miner, forgettable. Then came the $50,000 bridge loan on the next project. Then $75,000 for permits nobody had anticipated. And every single time, Natalie was sitting right there, eyes full of hope, and I could never make myself say no. What kind of father kills his daughter's dreams? Except at some point, I'd stopped asking whether those were actually her dreams at all. The car swung onto my block. Through the gates, I could make out the main house, Mediterranean, put up 10 years ago. Beyond it, the guest house where Brant and Natalie had been living for the past year. Temporary arrangement, they had both insisted, just until the investments turn around. Around Brant, temporary was a word that had no expiration date. I paid the driver and let myself inside. The quiet pressed in immediately. This house used to push back against silence. My late wife Lorraine had a gift for filling every corner of it. Music, voices, noise that meant something. After she died 8 years ago, I'd channeled everything into the work, expanding the business relentlessly. 7 locations now spread from Miami to Coral Gables to Key Biscayne. Every one of them thriving. Every one a testament to what discipline and careful thinking can build. Strange, isn't it, that I could engineer all of that and still not register what was being built or dismantled right under my own roof? I poured a Glenfiddich 18-1 of the rare indulgences I still gave myself and took up a position by the window with the pool below me. The lights in the guest house were burning. Brant and Natalie were no doubt in there running their own version of the evening. I sat with the question of whether she was standing up for me or covering for him, and whether she had any idea how different she seemed now. The Natalie I used to know, my Natalie had teeth. She'd push back on everything, restaurant menus, politics, whatever I said. She'd been deep into business management, building towards something of her own. That was 5 years ago, before Brant walked in. Now she wore more makeup. I'd caught that detail months back and talked myself into thinking it was just a preference shift. Tonight, I wasn't so sure. Bruises, stress. The laughter had gotten scarcer, too. And whatever smile she put on these days, it stopped at the surface. She'd pulled inward. At the table on family occasions, she'd go quiet while Brant filled the air. When I'd tried to get her thoughts on the business, she'd glance sideways at him first, like she needed clearance to have an opinion. How had I let that go unremarked? How had I squared that with any version of normal? Because I hadn't wanted to know. Simple as that. Knowing would mean facing the fact that I'd dropped the ball as her father. Knowing would mean looking straight at the truth that the man she married was methodically taking her apart, piece by piece. But tonight, Brant had miscalculated. He'd put his hands on me where anyone could see. He'd dragged this out of the private shadows and into a room full of witnesses. In doing so, he'd cut the rope of obligation that had been holding me back. I had no business controlling Natalie's marriage, but nobody got to swing at me and walk away clean. I set the glass down and crossed to my home office. Business books lining the walls, industry journals, photographs of every restaurant I'd ever opened. Desk holding the laptop, the phone, the organized machinery of my life. Built from zero. Survived downturns, recessions, the pandemic that drove half the restaurants across South Florida into the ground. I'd gotten there through meticulous planning, an eye for detail, and the discipline to cut losses when the numbers stopped making sense. Brant thought he was dealing with a sentimental old fool he could shove into a corner. He believed my love for Natalie was a lever he could pull whenever he needed something. He was about to discover the gap between sentiment and strategy. I opened my laptop and started taking notes. Brant's business dealings. I needed the full picture. His debts, his partners, whatever skeletons were rattling around in his closet. Every man has them, particularly men who project confidence as aggressively as Brant did. That Rolex this morning, the Porsche Panamera, the expensive suits. Where was any of it coming from? Not from his collapsed projects. My phone lit up. A text from Natalie. Dad, I'm so sorry about tonight. Brant didn't mean it. He's under a lot of stress. Didn't mean it. How many times had those 4 words come out of her mouth over the years? How many excuses had I swallowed because I wanted to believe her marriage had a fighting chance? I typed back, we'll talk tomorrow. I love you. What I didn't type, your husband just made the worst mistake of his life. I looked out at the darkness again. The guest house had gone dark. Brant and Natalie had turned and no doubt convinced the night's unpleasantness was already behind them. That I'd nurse my bruised jaw and my bruised ego for a few days, then fall obediently back into my role as the family's personal bank. They had it wrong. I'd been a good father, maybe too good for my own good. I'd put Natalie's happiness ahead of my own better judgment. I'd turned a blind eye to warning sign after warning sign because I wanted her to have what Lorraine and I had built together, a real partnership, something worth having. But Brant wasn't building anything with her. He was constructing his own edifice on the wreckage of mine, and he was using Natalie as the load-bearing wall. That was finished now. I drained the rest of my Glenfiddich and shut the laptop. Tomorrow I'd start digging. Tomorrow I'd hang up the role of accommodating father-in-law and pick up the one I actually knew how to play, the man who'd assembled a restaurant empire one calculated move at a time. The slap last night had been meant to knock me down. Instead, it had snapped me awake. The rules had just changed, and I intended to win this time. Morning arrived with the kind of Florida sunshine that makes everything look deceptively serene. I sat at the desk in my home office coffee, going cold beside the keyboard, watching Brant through the window that framed the pool area. My son-in-law, and wasn't that label beginning to taste like something rotten, was sprawled across one of my deck chairs, phone to his ear laughing at something. Less than 12 hours after punching me in front of 50 people, and he was laughing like a man without a care in the world. No apology, no visible remorse, not even the basic decency to look ill at ease. The sun hit his wrist at an angle. I leaned in. A Rolex Daytona stainless steel blue dial. I knew exactly what I was looking at because I'd nearly bought the same model myself the year before. $40,000 give or take. I'd spotted it on him that morning when he wandered into my kitchen for coffee. Worth noting, 3 days ago, he'd had a Breitling on that wrist. A respectable watch, but nowhere near Rolex money. So, where had $40,000 come from? Not from his development ventures, which had somehow absorbed $325,000 of my capital and produced exactly nothing in return. Brant laughed again, working his hands through the air as he talked. Even through the glass, I could read his body language loose, assured the posture of someone who believes he's already won. I picked up my coffee. Stone cold, but I barely registered it. I was too absorbed in replaying every exchange I'd had with Brant across 3 years. The Breitling to Rolex jump wasn't the only thing that had appeared lately. The week before, I'd clocked new tires on his Porsche Panamera, probably $3,000. A couple of months back, a leather jacket that had the look of something expensive. 6 months before that, he'd mentioned offhandedly that he'd upgraded to a suite for a weekend away. Each time I put money into one of his urgent business needs, something new materialized. The pattern was becoming difficult to ignore. Brant wrapped up one call and immediately launched into another. I couldn't make out the words, but his face gave him away that particular expression, the one reserved for salesmanship, for working somebody. The same look he'd directed at me every time a new request was coming. My jaw still ached from the night before. I pressed my fingers to it carefully. The bruise would be gone inside a week or so. What had shifted in me, though, wasn't going to fade along with it. Something had closed quietly and permanently. I was done being the willing target in this operation. Brant pushed himself up from the chair, stretched and started toward the main house, toward my kitchen, to help himself to my food under my roof the morning after assaulting me in my restaurant. You had to hand it to him for sheer nerve. Almost. That evening, Natalie pushed for a family dinner. 3 separate texts, each one more desperate than the one before. "Dad, please, we need to talk. We're still family." Family. That word was getting a serious workout these days. I said yes, not because forgiveness was anywhere on my agenda, but because I was curious. I wanted to watch Brant work. Would he apologize, pretend the whole thing had never occurred, find some way to invert the story, and make me the one who owed an explanation? They came at 6. Natalie looked hollowed out. Dark rings beneath her eyes she'd done her best to cover. She wrapped her arms around me carefully, like I was something fragile. "Dad, I'm so sorry about last night." "You've already said that, sweetheart." I touched my lips to her forehead. "You're not responsible for what he does." Brant came in behind her, a bottle of wine extended like a peace offering. Opus 1. $80 probably. I found myself wondering whose money had covered it. "Gerald," he said, "hand out the way you'd greet a business contact you hadn't seen in a while. I'm glad we can put last night behind us." Put it behind us. He'd reduced a punch to the face to something you simply set aside, like a scheduling conflict. Like I'd imagined the whole thing. I shook his hand, firm grip, held his eyes, played the part. "Of course," I said. "We're family after all." His smile opened up. He thought the game was already over. We sat down to eat. Pan-seared halibut, roasted asparagus, a meal Natalie had put together in my kitchen. She filled the air with nervous conversation, darting between friends' restaurant news, anything except the one subject everyone was thinking about. Brant waited until we were midway through the main course. Then he settled back in his chair, wine glass in hand, and said, "Gerald, I want you to know, I get why you were upset last night. It was a big ask. But Natalie and I are building something together. We need backing." Backing. Notice the word he chose. Not collaboration, not a two-way arrangement. Backing as in, I was meant to stand behind them financially while they constructed their lives on top of mine. The Palm Beach estate, he went on, just sits empty most of the year. We could put it to real use: networking events, client entertaining. Think of it as putting an idle asset to work. Our future, our future. He kept reaching for that plural, threading Natalie into every sentence as though she and his ambitions were a single, indivisible unit. Natalie was staring at her plate. She hadn't touched the halibut in 5 minutes. "Her father is upset over nothing," Brant said, directing this at her rather than at me. "He doesn't understand how modern families actually operate, how real partnerships function." I sliced a piece of fish, chewed it, took my time. "How do modern families work, Brant?" He leaned forward, sensing an opening. "We pool our resources. We build together. We don't sit on assets like we're bracing for a siege." "An interesting philosophy," I said. "Tell me where things stand with your current projects. How is the Pompano Beach development coming along?" His smile wavered barely, but enough. "Timing in the market has been tricky, but we're close to breaking ground, and the permits, the ones the $75,000 was meant to cover, still in process. These things move slowly, Gerald. The development world has a lot of moving parts. Not the sort of thing you'd be familiar with. I wouldn't be familiar with it, right? I'd only built 7 restaurants from a standing start, so naturally the mechanics of filing permits were beyond me." Natalie's fork hit her plate with a small clatter. "Dad Brant has put real work into these projects. The market has just been against him." She was still defending him. After everything, after last night, after a $40,000 watch that had no business being on his wrist, she was still covering for him. I looked at my daughter and softened my expression. "Of course, sweetheart. I have no doubt Brant works very hard." Brant eased back in his chair. He figured he'd steered through the rough water. He was already picturing us resetting to the old arrangement, him reaching me, handing over Natalie, holding it together in the middle. But that arrangement was gone. I finished the meal, kept the conversation light, asked easy questions, played the part of the father-in-law who had moved on. All the while, I was building a list. The Rolex, the wine, the casual brushing aside of every legitimate concern I'd raised. The way he spoke to Natalie, less like a partner, more like a stage prop. And underneath all of it, something was coming into focus that I couldn't unsee. This had never really been about the villa, not from the beginning. What Brant was after was control. He wanted his hands on everything I'd spent a lifetime building, and he was prepared to manipulate my daughter, assault me in a room full of witnesses, and gaslight us both to get there. After they left that evening, I sat in my study for a long time, looking at nothing in particular. Then I pulled up my laptop and went searching for private investigators in Miami. It was time to find out exactly who Brant Dillon actually was, and more to the point, what he'd been keeping hidden. Locating a private investigator proved simpler than I'd anticipated. No favors to call in, no connections to tap. Just 3 hours of methodical research, reading reviews, verifying credentials, cross-referencing track records. Vincent Harker's office occupied a forgettable building in the downtown Miami. No gleaming signage, no premium address, just a door with his name stenciled on the glass, and a waiting room that hadn't been touched since somewhere around 1994. I took to him immediately. He was roughly my age, maybe a year or two, past it, with silvering hair and the kind of weathered eyes that belong to a man who has seen everything at least twice. Former detective, his website said. 25 years with Miami PD before striking out on his own. Mr. Whitfield, he said, shaking my hand without any of the performative grip that Brant always deployed. What can I do for you? I took the chair across from him. It groaned under me. I need a complete picture of my son-in-law, Brant Dillon. His finances, his business activities, his associates, all of it. Vincent drew out a notepad. Old-fashioned. I appreciated that. Any particular context? He put his fist in my face last night at my daughter's birthday party in front of 50 guests. I need to know who I'm really dealing with. He wrote something down and nodded. Fair enough. This takes time. A week, maybe 2, depending on the terrain. Take whatever time the job requires. Just don't cut corners. Never do. He glanced up. I charge $200 an hour plus expenses. Rough estimate, you're looking at $10,000 to $15,000 for a thorough background package. I reached for my checkbook. I'll put up $20,000. Start this afternoon. He raised an eyebrow, said nothing, took the check, and moved straight to questions. What did I know about Brant's business dealings, his regular associates? Where he spent his time, what his routines looked like. I answered everything I had, and as I did, it struck me how thin my actual knowledge was of the man who'd married my daughter. I knew his exterior, the charm, the pitch, the polished ambition, but the interior was a blank. Vincent read the frustration on my face. Most people don't start digging into family members until things have already gone wrong, he said. It's human nature. We default to trust, which makes it exploitable, I said. Very. He closed the notepad. You'll have a preliminary report in 3 days, full picture in 2 weeks. My next appointment was one I'd been putting off. Something about bringing lawyers into family matters felt like waving a white flag. But Brant had rewired the situation the moment he threw that punch. Carolyn Reese's office was in Coral Gables waterfront, views understated furniture that cost a fortune. She'd handled the legal work on my restaurant expansion 5 years back. Sharp no-nonsense and allergic to drama. Gerald, she said, waving me toward the chair opposite her desk. Your message flagged this as urgent. Family law matter, I said, specifically about protecting what I own here in Florida. Her expression clicked into professional focus. Your daughter's marriage is concerning you. Her husband threw a punch at me last night in my own restaurant. I want to know exactly where I stand legally on my property and my business. She brought something up on her screen. Florida operates under equitable distribution. Assets acquired during a marriage are generally divided fairly in a divorce, but fairly doesn't always mean equally, and the exceptions matter. Property owned prior to the marriage stays separate as long as it isn't commingled with marital assets. Gifts and inheritances flowing to one spouse remain that spouse's property, and prenuptial or postnuptial agreements can reshape all of it. I leaned in. The Palm Beach estate, I acquired it 15 years ago, well before Natalie ever crossed paths with Brant. Title is still in my name alone. Then it's yours and yours alone, Carolyn said. They have no claim to it whatsoever. Good. Something loosened in my chest. What about the restaurant group? Same logic applies. You built it before their marriage. It belongs to you. That said, she paused. The money you've been transferring to him for these ventures complicates the picture. I've extended him approximately $325,000 across 3 years. She winced visibly. Loans or gifts. He called them investments. I thought of them as loans, but nothing was committed to paper. That's a real problem. Without written documentation, he could characterize every dollar as a gift. You'd need evidence of agreed terms to have any hope of recovering it. I sat with that. The checks I'd written always against his assurances of returns, the projects that evaporated, the excuses that followed like clockwork. What if I could establish financial fraud? I asked. Her eyes sharpened. If you can show he deliberately misrepresented his projects or funneled investment money toward personal expenses, that's a different matter entirely. That crosses into criminal fraud. Walk me through it hypothetically. What would I need to prove it? Documentary evidence. Bank statements tracing where the funds actually went. Records demonstrating the promised projects were fabricated or never advanced. A clear pattern of deception. She paused. Do you have grounds to suspect fraud? I thought about the Rolex, the Porsche upgrades, the expensive lifestyle being maintained on no visible income. I've got someone looking into it. Carolyn gave a slow nod. If fraud is proven, everything shifts. He'd be on the hook, not just to repay the money, but potentially to face criminal prosecution. And in any divorce proceedings, established fraud can reshape asset division, custody arrangements, even spousal support. Natalie has no idea any of this is being looked into, I said. That's not unusual. Financial abuse tends to operate in the dark. She studied me. Gerald, I have to ask you something. Are you worried about other kinds of abuse as well? I thought about Natalie's hollow eyes, the quietness that had settled over her like a second skin, the small flinch when Brant raised his voice over dinner. I honestly don't know, I said, but I intend to find out. We spent another hour working through option strategies and the protections available to me. By the time I stepped outside, the legal landscape had taken shape. Florida law had its complications, but it also had its protections. Brant might believe he had a handle on how this all worked. I was already ahead of him. 3 days later, Vincent called. Got something you'll want to see. I was at his office that afternoon. He dealt the documents across his desk like a man who knew exactly what cards he was holding. Brant Dillon, he said, is buried in debt. 1.2 to 2 million owed to private lenders, none of them patient 6 months behind on most of it. Private lenders, the kind who charge 20% interest, don't show up on credit reports and expect either payment or something worth taking. He pushed across another stack, bank statements, credit card records, transaction logs. The story they told was ugly. Money that came from me flowed into Brant's accounts and back out almost immediately. Casino platforms, luxury purchases, cash withdrawals. He has a serious gambling problem, Vincent continued. Online poker, mostly some sports betting on the side. He's down $85,000 in the past 3 months alone. The Rolex suddenly clicked into focus, either complete madness or a kind of desperate logic, depending on how you looked at it. Brant was spending like someone who'd just come into money while quietly going under. The behavior of a man torching everything to keep up an image while the floor dissolved beneath him. The Pompano Beach development, I asked. Vincent made a short sound. Doesn't exist. The permit applications he referenced never filed. The property he was supposedly developing belongs to someone else entirely and isn't on the market. So, it was all invented. Vincent confirmed it. He's been using your capital to service debts, sustain a gambling habit, and project the appearance of success. I stared at the papers spread in front of me, 3 years of fabrications laid out in plain black and white. $325,000 gone, swallowed by casinos and status purchases, while Brant performed the role of the driven entrepreneur. Vincent wasn't finished. He slid another folder forward. This one had photographs. There's also this. The image showed Brant with a woman I'd never seen before, entering the Biltmore Hotel. Multiple dates, several different angles. The body language needed no interpretation. Her name is Tiffany Holden, Vincent said. Works as a medical device sales rep. They've been involved for at least 4 months. I looked at the photographs for a long time. Brant and Tiffany laughing over drinks. Brant and Tiffany going into a hotel room together. Brant and Tiffany moving through the world as though Natalie didn't exist. "Does my daughter know anything?" I asked. "I don't believe so. He's been methodical about it. Different hotel each time. Always during working hours when she's at your restaurant." I collected the documents, the photographs, the full record of Brant's betrayal. For 3 years, I'd watched this man work my daughter over, hollow out my accounts, and grind down everything my family had built. For 3 years, I'd rationalized extended grace, found ways to look elsewhere. I'd been playing checkers. Brant had been running chess repositioning pieces while I watched the wrong square. But the game was still going, because Brant had miscalculated badly. He'd assumed I'd stay in the part he'd written for me, the agreeable father-in-law, the open wallet, the man who absorbs a hit and says nothing. What he'd failed to account for was this. I'd assembled a restaurant empire through patience, precision, and knowing exactly when to fold a losing hand. More critically, I knew how to spot a cheat at the table, and I had no use for cheats. I settled Vincent's fee and told him to keep digging. Then I went straight back to see Carolyn Reese, these documents under my arm. "Can we actually use this?" I asked. She went through the evidence with care. What I was about to discover would rewrite everything I thought I understood about the man my daughter had married. "Before I take you there, let me ask you something. If someone close to you had been quietly working against you for years, would you confront them the moment you knew, or would you wait and build your case in silence?" When she looked up, there was a smile on her face. "Gerald, we can do more than use this. We can bury him." It was the first time I'd smiled since the punch the night before. "Tell me how." A week after sitting down with Carolyn, I picked up the phone and called Brant. My voice was warm, conciliatory, the register of a man who'd decided he'd overreacted. "I've been thinking about what you said about family, about what it means to have each other's backs." A beat of silence on his end. I could almost hear the gears turning the recalibration. "Gerald," he said, picking his words, "I'm glad you reached out. Would you be willing to have dinner with me, just the two of us? I think we need to clear some things up." Another pause. "Of course. When tomorrow evening?" "My restaurant at Key Biscayne, 7 o'clock. The smile came through in his voice even over the phone. He thought he'd scored again. "I'll be there." The Key Biscayne location was my newest elevated oceanfront, the kind of room where serious money changed hands and power got put on display. I'd reserved a corner table removed from the other diners. Whatever was said tonight needed to stay between us. Brant arrived in that Rolex and a suit that had probably run $3,000. My money wearing fine clothes and acting like it belonged there. "Gerald." He clasped my hand with that assured, practiced grip. "This is a stunning place. The setting, the feel, the views. You've outdone yourself. Thank you." I pointed to the seat across from me. "Please, I already ordered wine and Opus One. I know you have a taste for it." His face opened up immediately. Exactly what I'd been expecting. Brant loved being anticipated, being catered to. It made him feel like the main event, like someone worth accommodating. It also made him sloppy. We kept things light through the appetizers. I asked about his development projects with every appearance of genuine curiosity. He built elaborate structures of fiction properties, investors' opportunities, perpetually on the verge of breaking open. The lies came as naturally to him as breathing. I matched his performance perfectly. The attentive father-in-law, the interested backer, the ready Mark lining himself up for one more round. Midway through the entree, I set down my fork and leaned back. "Brant, I owe you an apology." He stopped, fork suspended. "Apologize. I didn't handle myself well at Natalie's party. You weren't entirely wrong. Families ought to support one another. I've been holding on too tightly to my assets, to my business, to how I think things ought to go." I lifted my wine glass. "But lately I've been sitting with the question of legacy. What I'm leaving behind. Natalie is my only child, and you're her husband. That makes you family whether I've acted like it or not." I tracked his expression closely. The calculation working behind his eyes was almost readable skepticism in one corner, appetite in the other, caution losing ground to greed by the second. Greed took it as it always did with Brant. "I appreciate you saying that, Gerald." He chose his words with care. "I've never wanted anything but a solid relationship with you. Natalie wants that too. Which brings me to something I'd like to put on the table." I set the wine glass down. "You've told me more than once that you need real capital for your projects. I'm prepared to invest $500,000 in your next development." His eyes went wide. For just a moment, the mask peeled back, and what showed underneath was pure unadorned greed. $500,000 was more than double anything I'd ever handed over at once. Gerald, that's an extraordinary offer, but I lifted a hand. We structure it properly. Attorneys' contracts, everything in writing and above board. Something flickered across his face. A trace of concern, maybe suspicion, but the appetite overpowered it. Absolutely. That's exactly the right way to approach it. Good. I drew out my phone and sent a text. My attorney is putting the paperwork together right now. We can execute it tomorrow. Carolyn Reese, you've met her? My lawyer. Yes. The tension went out of his shoulders. He knew Carolyn had handled my restaurant expansions. In his mind, this was standard business, not a snare. We wrapped up dinner with Brandt, already running numbers in his head, mapping out how he'd put the money to work. I sat across from him and listened with the patience of a man who already knew how the story ended. The contract Carolyn produced was a small masterwork, 23 pages, dense and deliberate. The clauses that carried the real weight were buried on page 17, paragraph 4, subsection C. In plain terms, they read, if the investment produced no returns within 6 months, or if financial fraud came to light, all of Brandt's assets, including any property held jointly with his spouse, would transfer to me as collateral until the debt was settled. Under Florida law, this was entirely enforceable. Aggressive, yes, but clean. Brandt signed without reading past page 3. His attorney, some junior associate retained at a cut rate, gave the document little more than a skim. I watched Brandt's signature land on the final page, committing him to terms he hadn't begun to understand. Carolyn had been grinning when she finished drafting it. It's elegant, she'd said. He'll hand you everything and never see it coming. 3 days after Brandt signed, Vincent brought me updated surveillance. Brandt and Tiffany Holden at the Biltmore Hotel again. More photographs this time, scattered across different dates and hours, a documented pattern of sustained deception. I spread them across my desk and took my time. Tiffany was attractive, younger than Natalie, lighter hair, wearing clothes that likely had Brandt's, which is to say, my money behind them. In the photos, they looked at ease with each other, comfortable, like two people who'd been this way far longer than 4 months. The irony had a particular bite. Brandt was constructing a whole second life with Tiffany while using my money to fund it. All of this while occupying my guest house and pushing for access to still more of what I'd built. I called Vincent. How long has this actually been going on? Best estimate. 8 months. Picked up just before the gambling really accelerated. So Brandt had been betraying Natalie for nearly the whole of their marriage. The wedding was 3 years back. 8 months of this meant it started around month 28, almost from the beginning. Does Tiffany know about Natalie? She's aware he's married. Doesn't seem troubled by it. She carries her own financial weight, student loans, credit card debt. My guess is Brandt's been subsidizing her, playing the generous partner. With my money, always my money. I locked the photographs away in a desk drawer. Not yet. Showing these to Natalie now would be a mistake. Timing was the whole game moved too early, and Brandt would manage the narrative paint himself, as the victim work her back into his corner. Wait too long, and the damage kept compounding. I needed the precise moment when he was already exposed, already cornered, already out of moves. That moment was coming. The $500,000 landed in Brandt's business account on a Friday. By Monday morning, Vincent reported that $200,000 had already moved to neutralize his most aggressive creditors. Another $100,000 covered the gambling debt. $50,000 disappeared into cash withdrawals. The remaining $150,000 sat untouched for exactly 48 hours before being routed to something called Pompano Beach Development Holdings, LLC. Pull that LLC apart, I told Vincent. He was back on the phone 3 hours later. It's a shell. Filing was initiated but never completed. No actual business behind it. Perfect. Brandt had taken my capital and fed it to a phantom company. Textbook fraud. Carolyn could build a case on that alone. I let myself smile. Brandt believed he was running me. Believed he'd landed another lifeline for his drowning operation. He had no idea that each transaction, each lie, each fraudulent transfer was laying another stone in the foundation of his own destruction. Chess players call it zugzwang, the position where every move available only makes things worse. Brandt was in zugzwang now. He just hadn't figured that out yet. The trap was in place. The evidence kept growing. The legal structure was solid. What I needed now was the moment to close it. 2 months went by. 2 months of watching Brant burn through money that wasn't his, deceiving my daughter, performing the role of the driven entrepreneur, while the ground beneath him gave way. I used those months well. Carolyn sharpened our legal approach. Vincent assembled additional evidence. I verified every document, checked every figure, made certain each piece was airtight. And then I did the one thing Brant wouldn't see coming. I invited them to celebrate Natalie's birthday properly, the celebration her birthday deserved, at the Palm Beach estate, the very property Brant had demanded, the one he'd struck me over, the one that would never under any circumstances be his. The invitation was framed as something intimate. Just Natalie Brant and a small circle of close friends. No crowd, no spectacle. Something warm and private, the appearance of family restored. Brant accepted without a second's hesitation. Naturally, in his reading of the situation, this was my surrender, my concession that he'd outlasted me and that what he wanted was finally coming his way. April at the Palm Beach estate was its own kind of beauty. Open sky, the warmth of the season, the Atlantic stretching out beyond the terrace without any visible end. I'd had one of my restaurant teams cater, the evening brought in the best bottles, built the whole atmosphere of reconciliation and quiet celebration. Natalie arrived looking tentatively hopeful, the guarded optimism of someone who wants to believe things might be turning around. She pulled me into a long hug. "Thank you for doing this, Dad. It means everything." "Anything for you, sweetheart," I said, and I meant every word. Everything I was setting in motion was for her, even the parts she didn't know about yet. Brant came through the door behind her, drinking in the estate, with a hunger he could barely keep off his face. I watched his eyes move across the room, cataloging everything. The vaulted ceilings, the ocean view, the furnishings that announced serious money. He was already picturing himself as the owner of all of it, already mapping out how he'd run the place. The evening unfolded beautifully. Excellent food, even better wine conversation that found its own easy rhythm. I played the perfect host, attentive, generous, warm. Brant loosened up entirely. He even cracked a joke about the awkwardness at the first birthday party, laughing it off as though landing a punch on your father-in-law was just a minor social faux pas. Dinner wrapped up, and I rose to my feet with a glass in hand. Before dessert, I told them I have something for Natalie. I produced an envelope, heavy stock, legal size, Natalie's name rendered in calligraphy across the front. "This is my real gift to you, sweetheart. The bracelet was beautiful, but this is your future." Natalie opened it carefully. Her eyes went wide as she worked through the pages inside. "Dad, this is half ownership of the restaurant business," I said. 7 locations, every asset, half of everything. It's yours, your separate property protected under Florida law." Her eyes brimmed with tears. I don't know what to say. Brant's face lit up like a slot machine hitting the jackpot. I could practically see the math running behind his eyes. Half the restaurants meant millions in value, meant access to capital, meant he'd finally gotten his hooks into my business. "This is amazing, Gerald," he said, his hand already reaching toward the documents. "We're so grateful." "It's Natalie's," I said quietly, "not yours. Separate property shielded from community assets. A gift from a father to his daughter." The smile locked on Brant's face like a hinge that had seized. His hand froze in midair halfway to the envelope. "I'm sorry, what? Under Florida law, gifts from parents remain separate property. This belongs to Natalie alone. I've structured it through a trust with Carolyn Reese, my attorney. You've already met specifically to ensure it stays protected." I watched understanding settle over him, the realization that I had just locked him out completely, that I'd handed Natalie financial independence while slamming the door on his access to it. His face cycled through several colors, red to white, to a curious grayish purple. "That's very protective of you," Brant said slowly. Every word sounded like it had to claw its way past his teeth. "I've learned the value of protection," I replied, holding his gaze. The other guests drifted over to congratulate Natalie, oblivious to the current running between Brant and me. She wrapped her arms around me, crying, thanking me for believing in her. I held her close, feeling the relief in her shoulders, the gratitude, the fragile hope that maybe things were finally turning around. Brant excused himself for the bathroom. I gave him 5 minutes, then went after him. I found him on the terrace, both hands locked on the railing, staring out at the ocean. His knuckles had gone white. "You think you're clever," he said, without turning around. "I think I'm careful. You're cutting me out deliberately, systematically. I'm protecting my daughter. He turned then, and whatever mask he'd been wearing had come completely off. The charming son-in-law was gone, replaced by something colder and harder underneath. You have no idea what you're playing with, do you? I moved closer. You've taken $325,000 from me across 3 years. The most recent $500,000 you routed into fraudulent accounts within days of receiving it. You are drowning in gambling debt. You're keeping a girlfriend afloat with my money, and you think I'm the one who doesn't understand what's going on here. So, biste distribuables. His face went slack for 3 full seconds. He just stood there with his mouth slightly open like a fish yanked out of water. I watched the color bleed out of him, watched his confident posture fold into something smaller and more desperate. He stopped recalibrating. You don't have proof of anything. I have proof of everything, Brandt. Bank statements, surveillance, photographs, testimony from your creditors. Documentation confirming the Pompano Beach development doesn't exist. Every lie, every manipulation, every dollar you took. All of it documented, verified, and ready to walk into a courtroom the moment it becomes necessary. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped the railing again. Natalie won't believe you. Natalie will believe the evidence, but I'm hoping it doesn't come to that. I'm hoping you're smart enough to... My phone rang. I glanced at the screen and allowed myself a small smile. Perfect timing. Vincent always had perfect timing. Excuse me, I said to Brandt. This is the call I've been waiting for, I answered, stepping back inside the villa. Vincent, yes, send them now. I ended the call and turned to find Brandt had followed me in. The other guests were in the living room laughing at something. Natalie was showing her documents to a friend. Everything looked civilized, warm, completely ordinary. Interesting timing, Brandt said, aiming for casual and landing somewhere short of it. He had pulled the mask back on, but it no longer fit the way it used to. The cracks were visible. I glanced at my watch. 15 minutes. That's how long it'll take them to get here. Who? I smiled. Not warm, not friendly. The smile of someone who had finally stopped playing defense and started playing to win. You'll see. The doorbell rang exactly 15 minutes later. Vincent always had perfect timing. I'd always appreciated that about him. I walked to the door myself, waving the catering staff aside. Brandt trailed a few steps behind me, working to appear casual and failing spectacularly. His hands were trembling slightly. The color had drained from him the moment I'd mentioned that phone call, and it hadn't come back. I opened the door to 3 men in business suits, professional serious, each carrying a leather portfolio that telegraphed legal documentation before anyone said a word. The first stepped forward mid-40s Hispanic, carrying the kind of easy authority that comes from 2 decades in finance. Mr. Whitfield, thank you for arranging this meeting. Of course, Dante. I shook his hand. Please come in. I turned to Brandt, whose face had traveled from pale to ash gray. Brandt, this is Dante Figueroa. He's the credit manager at Century Capital Bank, the bank holding your primary business loans. Brandt's mouth opened. No sound came out. I'd seen that same expression on fish at the market the instant they understood they'd been caught. Dante offered Brandt a polite nod. Mr. Dillon, we've been attempting to reach you for several weeks. Your assistant said you were unavailable. I don't have an assistant, Brandt whispered. Yes, we eventually figured that out. Dante's smile was professional and completely without warmth. Hence this meeting. The 2 men behind Dante stepped forward. One was tall and angular, wearing a suit that looked custom-made. The other was shorter and broader, with a face that suggested he had personally encountered every variety of financial fraud the world had to offer. This is Conrad Paxton and Stuart Leung, Dante said, representatives of the private lending groups you've been borrowing from. Brandt's legs appeared to stop working. He grabbed the back of a chair to stay upright. Gerald, what is this? I gestured toward our guests. This is accountability, Brandt. Something you've managed to sidestep for quite a while. Natalie appeared from the living room, her expression worried. Dad, what's happening? Nothing that concerns you, sweetheart. Why don't you go look after the other guests? I'll take care of things here. She hesitated, her eyes moving between me and Brandt, then slowly retreated toward the living room. I could feel her watching from the doorway. Dante opened his portfolio, drawing out documents thick with tabs and highlighting. Mr. Dillon, per our records, you carry outstanding loans with Century Capital totaling $460,000. These are now 90 days past due. We've sent multiple notices. There's been a misunderstanding, Brant started. Additionally, Conrad Paxton cut in, his voice clipped and precise. You owe my clients approximately $740,000 in private loans. Interest has been accruing at 20% annually. You are now 6 months delinquent. Brant's face was doing remarkable things, cycling from gray to red to something approaching purple. Sweat stood out on his forehead, despite the cool ocean breeze drifting through the open terrace doors. And finally, Stuart Leung said quietly, there is the matter of the Pompano Beach development project, the one Mr. Whitfield invested $500,000 in 2 months ago. Brant's eyes cut to me. I returned a pleasant smile. We've examined that project, Leung continued. It doesn't exist. The LLC filing was abandoned. The property you represented as under development belongs to someone else and is not for sale. The permits you referenced were never filed. This is... Brant looked around wildly, hunting for an exit. This is a setup. Gerald engineered this. He's trying to frame me. Frame you. I stepped closer. Brant, these gentlemen have documentation stretching back 3 years. Bank statements tracing where my money actually went, gambling sites, luxury purchases, cash withdrawals, all while you were telling me you were building developments and creating opportunities. Dante passed me a folder. Mr. Whitfield requested copies of the financial analysis. It's quite thorough. I paged through it, though most of it was already familiar from Vincent's investigation. $85,000 lost on online poker over 3 months. The Rolex on Brant's wrist, purchased 2 weeks after I handed him $75,000 for construction materials. The Porsche Panamera, upgrades coming right on the heels of the $200,000 investment in the Pompano Beach project. Brant's knees buckled. He actually went down, hands clutching the chair for support. Gerald, please, we're family. I made mistakes, I know that, but I can fix them. I can pay everything back. Just give me time. Time? I crouched down until I was level with his eyes. You've had 3 years, Brant. 3 years of time, of second chances, and of my money. You used that time lying, stealing, and treating my daughter like a piece on your game board. His eyes were wet now. Tears or sweat, I couldn't tell. Maybe both. Natalie doesn't need to know about any of this. We can work something out, man to man. Natalie deserves to know everything, I said quietly. But not from me. From these gentlemen in their fraud complaint, and from the photographs Vincent took of you and Tiffany Holden at the Biltmore Hotel. The color left his face so completely, I thought for a moment he might actually go down. His lips moved without producing a sound. Then finally, how long have you known? Long enough? I got to my feet. The contract you signed 2 months ago, the $500,000 investment. Did you read it, Brant? I'll remind you of the key terms. Page 17, paragraph 4, subsection C. It states that in the event of fraud or default, all your assets, including community property with your spouse, transfer to me as collateral. You signed that, Brant. Your lawyer witnessed it. I watched it land on him, the understanding that he had signed the mechanism of his own destruction, that every move he'd made over those 2 months had been driving him deeper into a trap I'd built around him. You planned all of this, he whispered. The dinner, the investment, the contract, this meeting. Yes, I said simply. I learned from the best. You showed me that the most effective strategies involve letting the other person believe they're winning, right up to the moment they lose everything. Dante cleared his throat. Mr. Dillon, we'll be filing formal fraud complaints with the district attorney's office. The evidence is substantial. Beyond that, the contract you signed with Mr. Whitfield gives us legal grounds to pursue asset seizure. We wanted to inform you face to face as a courtesy. Courtesy, Brant's voice cracked. You call this a courtesy? More courtesy than you extended to your father-in-law when you hit him at his daughter's birthday party, Dante said coolly. Yes, we're aware of that incident. It's in the report. Brant looked at me with something caught between hatred and desperation. You can't do this. I'll fight it. You'll what? I asked. Hire an attorney with money. You don't have contest documentation from 3 separate financial institutions. Explain away the surveillance photos, the bank statements, the testimony from suppliers you never paid. He had no answer. He just knelt there on the floor of my villa, the man who had believed he could strip everything from me, now understanding he had nothing left to take. Family. I said, using his favorite word against him, doesn't lie to each other. Family doesn't steal. Family doesn't abuse trust and then play the victim when they're caught. You're not family, Brant. You never were. You were always just a predator who spotted an opening and walked through it. I turned to the three men. Thank you for coming. My attorney Carolyn Reese will coordinate with your legal teams on the filings. They nodded, gathered their documents, and took their leave. Professional to the last. Brant remained on the floor, broken. I looked down at him and felt nothing but satisfaction. This was the moment I had been building toward, the moment the man who had hit me, stolen from me, and used my daughter as a playing piece finally grasped that actions carry consequences. You should probably go, I said quietly. Natalie has some documents to sign regarding the restaurants. Family business, you understand. The following morning, Brant hired Gavin Mercer. I knew this because Carolyn called me at 7 a.m., her voice clipped with professional concern. Gerald Brant just retained Mercer. This is going to turn ugly. Gavin Mercer was Miami's most aggressive defense attorney, the kind of lawyer who won through intimidation, media pressure, and scorched earth tactics. He'd built his name defending white-collar criminals, and he didn't come cheaply. I found myself wondering which of Brant's remaining credit cards he'd burned through to cover the retainer. How ugly, I asked, though I already had a fairly clear picture. He's going to frame you as a vindictive father-in-law who entrapped his client. He'll claim emotional manipulation, elder abuse against Brant, undue influence. He'll work to position Brant as the victim of your wealth and power. Let him try. I poured my morning coffee. We have documentation. Documentation stops mattering if he turns Natalie against you first. That's Mercer's specialty, finding the emotional pressure point and squeezing until something gives. Carolyn was right. 2 hours later, Natalie called. Dad, I need to see you, now. Her voice carried a coldness I'd never heard from her before. Brant had gotten to her first. They arrived at my Coral Gables estate together, Natalie and Brant, with Gavin Mercer trailing behind them like a well-dressed vulture. I opened the door to find my daughter looking exhausted and furious, standing beside the husband who'd been deceiving her for 3 years. Living room, I said, can I get you coffee? We don't want your coffee, Brant said. He'd found some nerve overnight, or perhaps Mercer had coached him on projecting confidence. We want answers. Mercer stepped forward and held out a business card I didn't take. Mr. Whitfield, I'm representing Mr. Dillon in this matter. We have serious concerns about the legality of your conduct. My conduct, I led them inside regardless. If they wanted a confrontation, they'd have it on my ground. Would that be the conduct where I documented 3 years of fraud, or the conduct where I offered my son-in-law a legitimate business opportunity that he immediately misused? You set him up, Natalie's voice cracked. You gave him money knowing he couldn't repay it. You trapped him with a contract he didn't even understand. There it was, Mercer's playbook. Cast Brant as the naive victim of my sophisticated manipulation. I looked at my daughter, really looked at her. Sweetheart, did Brant tell you about Tiffany Holden? The born for Despinas Gesserst. She flinched. That's not relevant. Did he tell you about the $85,000 he lost gambling while you were pulling 60-hour weeks at my restaurant? Oh, inagwan desmazin wearer spinbra. I had a problem, Brant cut in quickly. I was under pressure with the business and I made mistakes, but I'm getting help. Did he tell you? I continued, my voice steady, that the Pompano Beach development never existed, that every project he pitched me over 3 years was fiction, that your entire marriage has been built on lies while he drained my accounts and made plans to claim the Palm Beach estate for himself. Natalie's expression collapsed. Dad, you're just I'm trying to protect you. I produced the folder I'd prepared Vincent's full investigation. Bank statements, surveillance photographs, gambling records, the registration documents for the fraudulent LLC. Everything. I set it on the coffee table between us. Look at all of it, then decide whether I'm the villain in this story. Mercer moved to block her. My client advises against reviewing unverified documents without legal counsel present. Your client, I said sharply, doesn't get to advise my daughter about anything anymore. Natalie, look at the evidence. She hesitated, glancing sideways at Brant. He was shaking his head almost imperceptibly, eyes pleading. Mercer stood between her and the folder, like a wall between her and the truth. But Natalie had always been smart, naive about love, perhaps too willing to trust, but smart. She reached out and picked up the folder. I watched her face as she read. Confusion shifting to shock, shifting to something harder and colder. She saw the bank statements showing my money flowing into Brant's accounts and straight out to casinos. She saw the photographs of Brant and Tiffany, time-stamped across 8 months. She saw the truth about the Pompano Beach project, or rather the complete absence of one. Jess, those are being taken out of context, Brant started. Shut up. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Just shut up. She kept reading page after page, the gambling addiction, the fraudulent business claims, the contract he'd signed without reading, binding himself to terms that would bury him. When she finally lifted her eyes, tears streaming down her face, she looked at Brant with something I'd never seen her direct at anyone before. Contempt. You told me we were building a life together. Her voice shook. You told me my dad didn't understand modern relationships, that he was old-fashioned and controlling and just trying to keep us apart. You told me you loved me. Her voice broke completely. Everything you said was a lie. Mercer stepped in smoothly. Mrs. Dillon, you're understandably upset, but we need to address the fact that your father engineered this entire situation. He supplied money, knowing it would be misused. He drafted a contract specifically designed to ensnare Mr. Dillon. This isn't justice, it's revenge. Vepsim Burpees. I turned to him. Your client assaulted me in front of 50 witnesses at my daughter's birthday party. He's been committing fraud for 3 years. He's defaulted on every loan agreement he signed with multiple financial institutions. And I'm the problem because I documented it. You entrapped him. I gave him exactly what he asked for: money and opportunity. What he chose to do with those resources was entirely his own decision. The contract was legal reviewed by attorneys and signed of his own free will. If he didn't read it, that isn't entrapment. That's negligence. Brant lurched toward me. You destroyed my life. You turned Natalie against me. You used your money and your connections to ruin me. No, I said quietly. You destroyed yourself. I simply made sure everyone could see what you'd built. Mercer produced his own documents. We're filing suit for intentional infliction of emotional distress, interference with business relationships, and elder abuse. Elder abuse? I nearly laughed out loud. I'm 64 and own 7 restaurants. He's 38 and buried under debt of his own making. Good luck making that case stick. We'll also be seeking a restraining order barring you from contacting Mrs. Dillon or interfering in their marriage. I want a divorce. Natalie's voice sliced through the room like cold steel. She got to her feet, wiping her eyes. Dad, I need your lawyer's number. Carolyn Reese, right? Brant's face drained white. Jess? No. We can work through this. It's your father doing the manipulating. My father saved me. She looked at me with something that was equal parts gratitude and shame. I should have listened to you years ago. I'm sorry it took this long. Sweetheart. No. She raised her hand to stop me. I made this choice. I married him. I believed him. That's on me. But I'm done. Mercer was already recalculating. I could see it working behind his eyes. Divorce changed the entire landscape. Without Natalie in the picture, Brant had no leverage, no community property claims, nothing left to hold. We're still filing the lawsuit, Mercer said. Fraud, entrapment, intentional harm. You file whatever you like, I said. I'll see you in court. Though I should mention that Carolyn has already submitted formal fraud complaints to the DA's office on behalf of Century Capital, the private lenders, and myself. Criminal charges, not civil. 6 felony counts at last count. Brant's face crumpled, that same defeated look I'd watched settle over him the night before at the villa. Gerald, please. I'll disappear. I'll leave Miami. Just drop the charges. That's not how it works, I said. The banks are pressing charges, not me. I'm simply a witness. You'd need to convince them to walk it back, and given that you owe them north of $1 million, I wouldn't count on their generosity. I shrugged. Mercer gathered his documents, his expression souring visibly. This isn't over, Whitfield. Actually, I said, I believe it is, but you're welcome to keep billing your client for that optimism. They left. Mercer furious, Brant broke, and Natalie staying behind. After the door closed, she stood in my living room, looking adrift. I've been so stupid. When I said, you were in love, there's a difference. He hit you in front of everyone, and I still defended him. You wanted to believe in your marriage. That's not stupid. That's human. She cried, then genuinely cried, and I held her the way I had when she was small, and the world felt too large and too frightening. But underneath the tenderness, I also felt the deep, settled satisfaction of knowing that Brant was finished. His lawsuit would go nowhere. His marriage was over. Criminal charges were waiting. And he had nothing, no money, no property, no future beyond whatever he could scrape from the wreckage of his own decisions. Sometimes revenge didn't need to be intricate. Sometimes you simply had to give someone enough rope and let them do the rest. The downtown Miami courthouse was the kind of building designed to remind you that justice meant something: gray stone, soaring ceilings, architecture that made you feel both small and accountable. I arrived early on June 15th in my best suit. Carolyn met me at the entrance with 2 briefcases loaded with documentation. "Ready?" she asked. "I have been ready for 3 months." We moved through security and made our way to courtroom 7A. Judge Beverly Ashford presiding. Carolyn had described her as fair, meticulous, and completely intolerant of fraud. Perfect. Brant was already seated at the defendant's table with Gavin Mercer. He looked thinner than he had in April, dark circles beneath his eyes, a suit that hung a little loose on his frame. The Rolex was gone, almost certainly pawned to cover Mercer's retainer. He glanced up when I walked in, and I watched his face perform that familiar color shift, pale sliding toward paler. Mercer placed a steadying hand on his arm and murmured something I couldn't catch. Natalie sat in the gallery just behind me. She'd insisted on coming, though I'd told her she didn't have to. "I need to see this," she'd said. "I need to see how it ends." The bailiff called the court to order, and Judge Ashford entered. She was in her late 50s with steel-gray hair and sharp eyes that signaled she had heard every excuse ever invented and believed none of them. Carolyn rose first. "Your Honor, Carolyn Reese, representing Gerald Whitfield. We're here on the civil complaint against Brant Dillon for fraud, breach of contract, and recovery of funds obtained through misrepresentation." Mercer stood. "Gavin Mercer for the defendant, Your Honor. We maintain that Mr. Dillon is the victim of entrapment and elder abuse by Mr. Whitfield, who deliberately—" "I've read the briefs, Mr. Mercer." Judge Ashford cut him off cleanly. "Let's hear the evidence." What followed was 3 hours of systematic dismantling. Carolyn laid out the bank statements showing my money flowing into Brant's accounts and being immediately redirected to gambling sites and personal expenditures. Vincent had done extraordinary work, every transaction documented, categorized, cross-referenced. She presented the fraudulent LLC registration for the Pompano Beach development. She called in testimony from suppliers Brant had claimed to engage but never paid. She walked the court through the contract Brant had signed, drawing particular attention to the clause he'd chosen to ignore. Then came the surveillance photographs. Brant and Tiffany Holden time-stamped across 8 months, different locations, different dates, no room for ambiguity. I watched Brant's face throughout. He tried to hold himself together at first, sitting upright, whispering to Mercer, but with each new piece of evidence he seemed to physically diminish. His shoulders curved inward, his hands tightened on the edge of the table. When the photographs appeared on the courtroom screen, his head dropped entirely. Mercer did what he could. He argued entrapment, that I had deliberately handed Brant money, knowing it would be misused. He argued that the contract had been designed to be incomprehensible. He even tried to reframe Brant's gambling as an illness deserving compassion rather than consequences. Judge Ashford's expression made clear she wasn't persuaded by any of it. "Mr. Mercer," she said during a pause, "your client signed a legal contract reviewed by 2 attorneys. He accepted $500,000 and immediately diverted it for fraudulent purposes. He has been lying to his wife, his father-in-law, and multiple financial institutions for 3 years. What precisely am I supposed to be sympathetic about?" Mercer had no satisfying answer. Then Carolyn played her final card, the recordings Vincent had obtained. Brant at a bar with one of his developer contacts 3 months earlier caught on someone's phone video. "The old man's such an easy mark. He'll hand over whatever I want as long as I keep Natalie happy. Dumbest investor I've ever dealt with." The courtroom went silent. I heard Natalie draw a sharp breath behind me. Brant's head snapped up, his face stripped down to raw panic. That's out of context. I was joking." "Mr. Dillon," Judge Ashford said coldly, "I'd strongly suggest you stop talking." Mercer looked defeated. He knew it was finished. The judge studied her notes for what felt like a very long time. Then she looked directly at Brant. "Mr. Dillon, I've presided over fraud cases for 15 years. This ranks among the most clear-cut examples I've encountered. You systematically deceived your father-in-law, misappropriated funds, created fictitious business entities, and displayed no remorse for your actions. The evidence is overwhelming." Brant's face had gone from pale to a grayish-white, the color of old newsprint. His hands trembled visibly against the table surface. I'm ruling in favor of the plaintiff. You are hereby ordered to repay Gerald Whitfield $485,000, plus interest totaling approximately $560,000. Additionally, under the terms of the contract you signed, all your assets are transferred to Mr. Whitfield as collateral until the debt is satisfied. Brant made a sound, something caught between a gasp and a sob. Furthermore, Judge Ashford continued, I'm approving the divorce petition filed by Natalie Dillon on grounds of fraud and infidelity. Given that all marital assets are encumbered by your debts, there will be no division of property. Mrs. Dillon is awarded a clean dissolution with no financial liability for your obligations. Natalie's hand found my shoulder. I reached up and held it. Finally, I'm forwarding the evidence of fraud to the district attorney's office for potential criminal prosecution. This court is adjourned. The gavel struck. For a moment, no one moved. Then Brant rose on unsteady legs and turned to face me. His eyes were red, his expression slack, a man watching his entire life collapse at once. You destroyed me, he whispered. I buttoned my jacket and stepped close enough that only he could hear me. No, I said quietly. You destroyed yourself. I just made sure everyone could see the ruins. I walked out of courtroom 7A with Natalie beside me and Carolyn just behind, already on her phone, coordinating with the financial recovery team. On the courthouse steps in the warm June sunshine, I paused and looked back. Through the windows, I could see Brant still at the defendant's table, Mercer collecting papers around him. He looked small, exactly as small as he had always been, beneath all that expensive cologne and borrowed confidence. Next time, I said to no one in particular, think before you hit someone who's actually smarter than you. Natalie laughed. A real laugh, the first genuine one I'd heard from her in months. Dad, that was savage. Word that I said was justice. July arrived with the kind of weather southern Florida does effortlessly. Endless blue sky, warm sun, the salt tang drifting in off the Atlantic. I stood on the terrace of the Palm Beach estate, the one Brant had demanded, the one he'd struck me, over the one that would never belong to him. The view was spectacular. It always had been. Somehow it looked even better now. Natalie had moved back to the Coral Gables estate 3 weeks earlier, not slinking home in defeat, but walking in with her chin up, already poring over restaurant operations and floating ideas for expansion. She'd thrown herself into the business with an energy I hadn't seen since before Brant. This morning, she'd called with news. She'd found a location in Sunny Isles Beach for our 8th restaurant. Prime spot, Dad. Ocean view, upscale neighborhood, everything we look for. What do you think? I'd asked, even though I already knew my answer. I think we should do it. I think we should build something extraordinary. That conversation was what had brought me here to the villa, a glass of excellent Sonoma Pinot Noir in hand with space to think. The past 4 months replayed in my mind like a particularly satisfying film. Brant's face when the creditors walked through the door, his panic when Natalie worked through the evidence, his complete unraveling in the courtroom the moment the judge ruled against him. That instant when Judge Ashford had said, I'm ruling in favor of the plaintiff. Brant's face had done something remarkable. The color had drained so thoroughly, he'd looked almost translucent. His mouth had opened and closed, without producing a sound, like a fish that had thrown itself out of its bowl. His hands had gripped the table until his knuckles went white, and I'd watched his whole frame sway slightly as though the floor had shifted beneath him. It had been, in a word, delicious. Vincent had called yesterday with an update. Thought you'd want to know. Brant Dillon is working as an assistant manager at a building supply store in Hialeah, $9.50 an hour. From aspiring real estate mogul to retail management at minimum wage, the fall had been spectacular. What about Tiffany Holden, I'd asked. Gone the moment the money ran out. Last I heard, she relocated to Atlanta with someone new, a medical device sales rep apparently with actual income. Of course she had. People like Tiffany and Brant were drawn to money the way moths are drawn to a flame. When the light went out, they moved on to wherever the next one was burning. My phone buzzed. A text from Natalie. Paperwork for Sunny Isles Beach is ready. Want a review? Tomorrow morning I'm thinking we open by Christmas. I smiled and typed back, your restaurant, your timeline. I trust your judgment. 3 dots appeared. Then, I love you, Dad. Thank you for pulling me out when I didn't even realize I was going under. My throat tightened, not from sentimentality. I'd promised myself I wouldn't indulge that, but from satisfaction. From knowing that Natalie was finding herself again, reclaiming the woman she'd been, before Brant had spent 3 years quietly dimming her. I thought about those 3 years. The loans, the excuses, the slow creep of manipulation. Brant gradually absorbing my guest house, my pool, my space, treating everything as though he'd earned it rather than been handed it. Natalie becoming quieter, smaller, less herself with every passing month. And then that moment at her birthday party, the punch that had rung out across Bay Terrace's banquet hall, the public humiliation that had finally shown me what I'd been too slow to see. Brant had believed that Blow would put me in my place, demonstrate who held the power, force me to sign over the villa and whatever else he had his eye on. Instead, it had been the first day of his undoing. I took a slow sip of wine. The villa's value had climbed since I'd purchased it now, somewhere around $4.3 million. Brant had wanted it badly enough to assault me for it, and he would never set foot here again. Under the terms of the judgment, he couldn't come within 500 feet of any of my properties. The irony was almost poetic. My phone rang. Carolyn Reese. Gerald just calling to let you know the asset recovery is complete. We've liquidated what little Brant had left. You'll recover about $47,000 from the sale of his Porsche Panamera and some personal items. The remainder will come through wage garnishment over roughly the next 30 years or so. 30 years. I laughed. At $9.50 an hour, that's about right, Carolyn said, with a dry satisfaction that I'd come to appreciate. He'll be 70 before it's cleared, assuming he never misses a payment and manages to stay upright. Thank you, Carolyn, for all of it. The pleasure was entirely mine. Cases like this are the reason I became a lawyer. After we hung up, I stood at the railing and watched the sun begin its long slide toward the horizon. The water caught the light in shades of gold and amber, the waves coming in with their steady and different rhythm. I let myself think about Brant one final time, not with anger that had burned itself out somewhere between the courthouse steps and this evening, not with pity either. He'd earned every consequence stacked against him. Just with a kind of cool, detached observation, the way you might study something curious under glass. He'd been so certain, so sure that charm and cunning were enough to carry a man through life indefinitely, that people existed to be used, that rules bent for those bold enough to ignore them, that consequences were always someone else's problem. He'd been wrong on every count, and I had learned something worth keeping. That patience was a weapon, that documentation was armor, that the best revenge wasn't loud or explosive. It was methodical, legal, and absolutely complete. The sun touched the water, painting the sky in deep reds and purples. My phone buzzed again, Natalie sending photographs of the Sunny Isles beach property. It looked perfect. I raised my glass toward the fading light, to justice restored, to new beginnings for both of us. Here's to family, I said to the empty terrace, the real kind, the kind that protects instead of praise, the kind that builds instead of destroys. The wine tasted better than any I could remember. If you've stayed with me until the end of this story, then you already know it wasn't really about the money. It wasn't even about the villa. What it cost me was 3 years of watching my daughter grow quieter and smaller, while a man I'd tried to welcome into my family treated everything I'd built as something he was entitled to take. What it taught me was harder to put into words, but I'll try. Patience isn't weakness, silence isn't surrender, and I believe God has a way of making sure the truth eventually finds the light, even when you have to do your part to hold the door open for it. The moment Judge Ashford read that ruling, I didn't feel triumph. I felt something quieter and more permanent than that. I felt like the scales had finally settled. If this family revenge story has spoken to something in your own life, here is what I'd want you to carry with you. Document everything. A paper trail is more powerful than any argument you can make in the heat of the moment. Protect your children even when they push back. Love sometimes means holding the line when they cannot see clearly enough to hold it themselves. Never let someone's confidence convince you they hold the power. Charm is not the same as strength. And when someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time, not the fifth. This has been Dad's Revenge. If this story moved, you share it with someone who might need to hear it today. A friend carrying a weight they haven't named yet, or someone who's been told to stay quiet and let it go. Leave me a comment below and tell me what you took from it. And if you haven't already subscribed so you don't miss what comes next. Thank you for being here with me. Until next time, take care of yourself and the people worth protecting.